If you've got spring fever, Lowe's has the cure. During SpringFest, make your landscape stand out with 3 free bags of Miracle-Gro 3/4 cubic foot garden soil when you buy 3. Plus, get up to 40% off select major appliances to keep clothes, food, and dishes fresh all season long. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 4/22 while supplies last. Selection varies by location. See Lowe's.com for details. Soil offer excludes Alaska and Hawaii.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by political scientist Michael Levy. And Michael, I'm glad to have you back for episode 3 of our new Rules of Politics series. This one is Know Your Coalition.
And hey, Mike, it's always glad to join you. And I am always excited about these sessions, even though it's only number 3. I can't wait till 4, 5, and 20.
Yeah.
So in this episode, we're going to discuss how strategy, messaging, and policy positions are shaped less by what people want or what the public wants, and more by what a politician's coalition might tolerate and reward. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as we've been doing this series is how often politics actually looks irrational on the surface if you're just a general observer. So I wanted to start with a single issue. Take something like marijuana legalization. And if you look at the public opinion polls, it's roughly about 2/3 of Americans support it, and it actually polls well across party lines, with about 85% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans supporting it. And yet, if you look at Congress still hasn't acted in any meaningful way, not even on relatively modest steps like banking access for cannabis businesses. And I was thinking about an example, and I was thinking about former House Speaker, Republican John Boehner, who, while he was in Congress, was opposed to legalization of marijuana. But after leaving Congress, he ended up joining a board of a cannabis company. And so if you assume that politicians are just responding to what the public wants, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think if we think about other political calculations based on politicians' various constituencies and their coalition, starts to make a hell of a lot of sense. And I think you see this pretty broadly too, as we think about this series and the focus on incentive structures. Your pre-show example was about Barack Obama's evolution on gay marriage, from supportive to opposing to supportive again throughout the 90s, 2010. And I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about the classic framework in political science that can help explain this. And it comes from Richard Fenno. Fenno was a influential scholar of Congress, and he had a 1978 book called Homestyle, in which he argued that politicians just don't have one constituency, they have multiple. And a key insight that stuck with me from that book is that all of these different 4 constituencies aren't equally important, and that can flip the way that we think about politics. And so why don't we start there, Mike? And can you walk us through Richard Fenno's framework from Homestyle, these different constituencies, and why that's such a powerful way to understand how politicians actually behave?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first constituency, and the one probably most people think of when they think of that term, is what Fenno called the geographic constituency, which is basically everyone in your district, if you're a member of the House, or in your state, if you're a senator. But Fenno's insight was that that's not the only constituency that office holders are concerned with. In fact, it's probably not even, generally speaking, the most important constituency, because in addition to that geographic constituency, first you have something called the re-election constituency, and that's essentially what it sounds like. These are the people who will likely be voting for you in the election. Those people, of course, are going to be more important to you than the people who wouldn't vote for you if you were the only candidate running. But in addition to those two, there's also something that Fenno called the primary constituency. He didn't mean primary elections. He meant what we would call today probably more the base, your loyalists, donors, volunteers, those sort of people. And it's important to know that in modern politics especially, those folks, the donors especially, might not even be part of your re-election or your geographic constituencies. They could be entirely out of the state or the district. And then finally, you've got what's called the personal constituency, and this is sort of the inner circle, your close friends, your family, top advisors, those sort of folks. And so in looking at this structure Fenno set up, you can make the case, and I think it's a pretty good case, that to win elections consistently, you have to work from that kind of bottom, smallest coalition up. So there's sort of this inverse relationship between the size of the constituency and the importance of the constituency to the person trying to either win or maintain office.
So you frame this, and obviously I agree with Fenno and agree with your analysis here, but you frame this as an inverse relationship where that smaller the group or the bottom group of the personal and then the primary or the base, the donors, the volunteers, that those are the most important. And I'm kind of curious why it is that those smallest constituencies often matter the most politically.
There are a lot of reasons for that, but probably the biggest reason that the personal constituency is the first one is that if you don't have a strong, tight, supportive inner circle in that personal constituency, your campaign's probably going to fall apart for a whole bunch of other reasons. And so that's incredibly important to have that support structure, because running for Congress is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's an awful lot of work, and you need good people around you. Now, the primary constituency is so important because, as we talked about in our Follow the Money episode, well, money is the oxygen of politics. And if you don't have millions of dollars, really, in this case, realistically, you're probably not going to be a viable contender. And more, that means going outside of your district or in your state to find money. And let me give you an example of how much that's changed and why this is a different environment. In 2012, which isn't that long ago, from members of Congress or people running for seats in district, that represented just over a third of the money contributed to what I'll call serious House candidates, people who raised over $200,000. But by 2024, that figure had gone down to only 17.6% of in-district money. The rest was from outside of the district. In the Senate, it was 51.8% in-state funding in 2012 compared to just 27.5% in 2024. So increasingly, we're seeing politicians have to go outside of their districts to raise money to win. And that, of course, makes them, at least in part, theoretically beholden to people who will never reside in the district or don't reside in the district that this person is going to be representing if they win.
Yeah, so I know you've mentioned the House and Senate in your response. And I was actually wondering if maybe talk a little bit about one presidential candidate in particular, because I'm thinking about Joe Biden. And Joe Biden certainly had a very tight-knit personal constituency, of his advisors and people who were in his orbit. But when I think about the 2020 election campaign, he wasn't one of those who had a really wide base. He wasn't raising money like many of the other candidates, Bernie Sanders, or even Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren. And so, maybe talk a little bit about how these different constituencies might work in a competitive primary where there's 6, 8, 10 candidates who are vying, where maybe you have a really strong, if you're thinking about that bottom base up, you have a really strong personal constituency, but maybe your base is a little bit weak. It's wide, but it's not deep.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. And that means so many new reasons to rack.
Because I always find something amazing.
Just so many good brands.
Because there's always something new.
Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
TaxAct understands you haven't memorized the tax code. That's why TaxAct has live experts to help. TaxAct can even do it for you if you prefer. It's the easiest way to know you're doing it right. Well, other than going back to college and obtaining a bachelor's degree in accounting with a minor in finance, then interning somewhere and becoming fluent in all tax forms. But that might be hard to accomplish before tax day. So maybe just stick with TaxAct. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because, of course, you're not doing this in a vacuum. If you're running for Congress or if you're running to be reelected, you're running against other people, at least a lot of the time, assuming you're not running unopposed. And so that's going to be an important factor because, for instance, there are only so many top-tier political advisors. They might seem like they're a dime a dozen, but the really good ones are not all that common. And if your opponents have already sucked those folks up, or in the donor base, if your opponents have already sucked those up, whether they're your primary opponents or your general election opponents, that sucks a lot of that oxygen out of the room for you. And so in a lot of cases, what's going to happen is that if there's no clear path to a winning coalition, a lot of high-quality potential candidates will just say, you know what, I'm not going to run this time because the environment isn't suitable for that. And so I think that's a really important point you raise.
Yeah, so I'm also I don't know if I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but before the show, I was thinking a little bit about coalitions and thinking about how whether the party moves or the electorate moves or whatever the case may be. Take an example in Florida where we've had, say, Charlie Crist, who was a Republican turned Democrat, and he started looking for different seats. And maybe that was, or looking for different ways to get back into elective office. He did get elected as a member of Congress as a Democrat, but then lost his reelection. What's interesting is he lost his reelection to David Jolly. And Jolly is a Republican who's now turned to become a Democrat and is running in Florida to the U.S. Senate. And so I'm also kind of wondering how, when we think about these different bases, how the interplay between them, when maybe your geographic constituency maybe changes because the boundaries have been changed, or maybe the party has changed because you no longer believe in the leader, say it's Donald Trump, or whether it's Barack Obama or somebody like that.
Yeah, we saw a lot of this in the 1990s as sort of those kind of old style Southern Democrats realized that their constituencies were becoming much more aligned to the modern Republican Party, and there was kind of that large shift. And so it becomes, in part, it's how we think about parties oftentimes is not really what parties actually are, because political parties, in the end, are vehicles for winning election and gaining and maintaining power. They're not primarily about ideology or even policy necessarily, which explains how the Republican Party, for instance, can go from something very different in, say, 2014 than it was in 2017, right? And so when you think about parties in that sense as just simply vehicles, as opposed to sort of ideological packages, I think that helps to explain certain things as well. Because, the politicians are asking the question, what's going to give me the best chance of winning this election? And sometimes it means running in a different district. Sometimes it means, changing my party even, though that's obviously, pretty rare.
I almost laughed a little bit when you said the 2014 to 2017. And then a few minutes ago, you talked about 2012 not being that long ago. And I almost came back with a quip, like 2012 seems like it's ages ago, like maybe it's a century ago, given American politics. But one thing I actually wanted to get back to just very briefly at the start of the show is around terminology, because in the pre-show notes and in the way that we define this, you've distinguished between a politician's formal constituency and that coalition that they actually rely on to win and to govern. And I was maybe wondering if you could help our listeners disambiguate between the terms constituency and coalition.
Yeah, it's the most basic level. Constituency is usually going to be defined or thought of in terms of geographic boundaries, whereas a coalition is much more defined by, the people who support you. And of course, while there may be overlap in there are plenty of folks who give to campaigns who don't live within that constituency. And so they're part of the coalition, but they're not part of the constituency.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to consider because when we listen to conversations in the ether about politics, I think sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And I want to make sure for our listeners, we're using constituency in today's conversation really about those geographic boundaries, either District 13 in Florida or the state of Florida or all of the U.S. if we're talking about a presidential election. But I want to ask a really naive question that I know is going to make me sound stupid, but what the hell, I'm pretty stupid. But, you've talked about in the pre-show notes that this idea of electoral efficiencies, that politicians don't need majority support from everyone, that they need just enough to win election. And I think this is where my naivete comes from, because why isn't it that politicians don't just try to appeal to everybody? Why don't they just try to appeal not only to, say, those lower level constituencies, say that primary, that base of electors or the people who are going to vote for you in election? Why don't they just appeal to everybody?
Well, they would certainly want to win by as much as possible because no one really wants, for all the talk about how wonderful competition is and so forth, mostly they don't want to be in competitive races. And so, of course, they'll want to get the largest margin as possible. But the problem boils down to one of, you might call it electoral efficiency, in that once you get to a certain point, once you get past your base, who are going to vote for you pretty much no matter what, and then your kind of leaners, and then the undecideds, well, every vote after that, the amount of resources, money, time you need to put in to get you have diminishing marginal returns for that. So every additional increment of voters becomes harder to get, more expensive to reach and to persuade. And given how expensive elections are in the first place, at some point you have to say to yourself, well, how many votes can I realistically get? There's going to be no point in, for instance, I would say, I would guess if Donald Trump were running again, and God knows, maybe he will, but there would be no point in him trying to get the Michael Levy vote, right? Because that would be an incredibly inefficient way for him to spend his money. And that's really important because also then, even if you have the money to spend, the question you're going to want to ask yourself is, what's the most efficient use of my campaign money? And in some cases, it might actually be more valuable for you as a politician to direct your resources not to your own race, which say you feel like fairly certain you're going to win by 8, 9, 10 points, but instead to take some of that money and give it to other races. So that way you could build influence within the party, perhaps rise within the party, that sort of thing. And so there are various things you can use that money for. You might not necessarily want to use it all on trying to get people you don't need to vote for you to vote for you. We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,